The shrill ring of my landline pulled me from my gardening. Dirt still under my fingernails, I answered to hear my son's voice, cold, rehearsed, professional, explaining how he'd scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor about my situation. Not our family's situation, not his father's estate. My situation. As if 67 years of managing money had suddenly evaporated from my brain along with my youth. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing gentleness reserved for children and the elderly, "we're worried about you making these big financial decisions alone." Dad always handled the investments. I let him finish, listening to him rewrite 43 years of marriage where apparently I'd been nothing but a decorative accessory while my husband Howard handled all our finances. If only my son knew who really balanced the books all those years. If only he realized whose careful planning had built the nest egg he was now so concerned about protecting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Alexander didn't know, what none of my children knew, was that I remembered everything, every account number, every password, every transaction. And most importantly, I remembered exactly who had paid for the credit cards they so casually used to help manage my expenses. I'm Gertrude Blackwood, Trudy to anyone who knows me well enough. My late husband Howard and I built a comfortable life in Milford, Connecticut. A life that allowed us to put 3 children through college without loans, to travel to 26 countries after retirement, and to leave something meaningful behind for our family. We weren't wealthy by today's standards, but careful investments. And Howard's pension from 30 years at the insurance firm meant we never worried about bills. Howard passed 3 years ago from a heart attack, sudden, cruel, and final. He was reading on our porch swing one moment, gone the next. The grief came in waves, sometimes receding enough to let me breathe, other times threatening to pull me under completely. The children helped as much as they could, especially in those first months. Alexander, our eldest, flew in from Chicago. Melissa came up from New York almost every weekend. Even Timothy, despite his busy medical practice in Boston, managed to visit regularly. I appreciated their concern, their company, the casseroles and cleaning and quiet conversations. But after 6 months, I needed to start living again, making my own decisions, finding my new normal. The children, however, seemed to interpret my grief as deterioration. Suddenly, my occasional forgetfulness, misplacing reading glasses, or forgetting which day the garden club met, became in their eyes signs of cognitive decline. It began subtly. Alexander suggesting I might want to simplify my financial situation. Melissa asking if I was keeping up with the bills. Timothy bringing articles about seniors and financial scams during his visits. I nodded, thanked them for their concern, and continued managing just fine. What they didn't seem to remember was that before I became just mom, I had been the bookkeeper for Howard's first business venture. I had balanced our household accounts for decades while Howard earned the income. I had researched every investment we ever made. The children somehow constructed a narrative where their father had been the financial mastermind, when in truth, we had been partners. Howard the earner, me the manager. Things might have continued in this awkward but manageable stalemate had Alexander not decided to take matters into his own hands. He arrived unannounced one Sunday afternoon, his wife Vanessa and their children in tow. His timing wasn't coincidental. It was the weekend Melissa and Timothy were both visiting as well. "Family meeting," he announced after dinner, his tone leaving no room for discussion. We gathered in the living room, the same room where we'd once played board games and opened Christmas presents, now feeling like a corporate boardroom under Alexander's command. "We need to discuss Mom's financial situation," he began, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with printouts. "I've been looking into her accounts." "You've been what?" I interrupted, my teacup freezing halfway to my lips. He continued as if I hadn't spoken. And I'm concerned about the management structure. Mom has at least 12 different accounts scattered across 7 financial institutions. It's unnecessarily complicated and impossible for her to manage properly. The room tensed. Melissa shifted uncomfortably while Timothy frowned. Vanessa kept her eyes down, inspecting her manicure with sudden interest. "Alexander?" I said carefully, setting down my cup. "I don't recall giving you access to my financial information." He had the grace to look momentarily embarrassed before recovering. "Dad made me a contingent on some of the accounts years ago. I'm only trying to help organize things." "I see," I said, though what I saw was much more than he realized. "And what exactly is your proposed solution?" This was evidently the question he'd been waiting for. He launched into a detailed proposal, consolidating my accounts under a financial advisor friend of his, setting up a simpler monthly allowance for my expenses, having my bills automatically managed by him and Vanessa. It would just be easier. "This way, Mom," he concluded, his tone suggesting he was offering me a tremendous favor. "You wouldn't have to worry about remembering all those passwords and due dates." The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I noticed Melissa and Timothy exchanging glances, neither jumping to my defense nor his. Vanessa studied the pattern on my carpet as if it contained hidden messages. "That's very thoughtful," I finally said, my voice steady. "Let me think about it." Alexander seemed surprised by my lack of immediate gratitude but nodded magnanimously. "Of course, take your time. We can meet with Craig, the financial advisor, next week." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that. School performances, Timothy's new hospital wing, Melissa's promotion. But underneath it all, I felt a cold realization settling in my stomach. My children saw me as incapable, diminished, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. After they left that evening, I went upstairs to my office, a small sunroom overlooking the garden Howard had built for my 60th birthday. From the antique secretary desk that had belonged to my mother, I pulled out a leather-bound ledger. Inside was a meticulous record of every significant financial decision Howard and I had ever made, from our first mortgage in 1975 to our most recent investment portfolio rebalancing shortly before his death. I ran my fingers over the pages, the familiar columns of numbers offering more comfort than my son's promises of help ever could. Then I opened my laptop, the same one Alexander thought I couldn't possibly understand how to use, and began reviewing my accounts. All 12 of them, across 7 institutions, each one deliberately structured, each serving a specific purpose, in my financial plan. What Alexander had failed to understand was that my system wasn't disorganized, it was diversified. It wasn't forgetfulness that led to this structure, but careful planning. Some accounts were high yield but less liquid. Others offered tax advantages for certain types of income. Still others were positioned for specific inheritance strategies I'd researched after Howard's death. More concerning than Alexander's presumption was how he'd accessed information he shouldn't have had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Being a contingent on an account didn't grant him the right to view balances without my knowledge. Had he called pretending to be Howard? Had he somehow intercepted statements? The invasion of privacy stung worse than the condescension. As I reviewed our family's financial picture, my eye caught on something odd, a series of credit card statements. Howard and I had always maintained 2 personal cards plus a business credit account for rental properties we owned. Yet here were statements for 5 additional cards, all tied to my primary account as the guarantor, all with substantial balances, none of which I regularly used. I clicked through the transaction histories, my confusion turning gradually to understanding, then to anger. Alexander and Vanessa had 2 of these cards, supposedly for emergencies after Howard died. Timothy had one for medical expenses when Mom needs help. Melissa's card was for picking up groceries and necessities for Mom. The transaction histories told a different story. Designer clothing purchases, high-end restaurants in cities I hadn't visited in years, airline tickets for vacations I hadn't been invited to join, home improvement materials for houses that weren't mine. The largest single charge, $12,400 for a financial consulting retainer, had been processed just 3 days earlier on Alexander's card. The vendor name was familiar, Craig Winters Financial Services, the same advisor he wanted to entrust with my life savings. I closed my laptop slowly, my hands steady despite the storm brewing inside me. The pieces weren't just falling into place. They were slamming together with the force of decades of underestimation finally finding its target. My son hadn't just appointed himself my financial guardian. He'd been using my credit to finance his own ambitions, likely convincing himself it was justified because eventually my assets would be his inheritance anyway. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my longtime attorney, Eleanor Washburn, who had handled Howard's estate and who Alexander didn't know existed because she was just Mom's friend from Garden Club. The second was to Frank Chen, our actual financial advisor of 15 years, who managed the investments Alexander hadn't been able to discover. The third was to my bank, requesting an immediate freeze on all auxiliary credit cards tied to my accounts. Then I waited. It took precisely 27 hours for the storm to hit. My phone rang Tuesday evening, just as I was settling in with a cup of chamomile tea, and the mystery novel my book club was discussing that week. Alexander's name flashed on the caller ID. I answered with the same mild tone I'd used all my life when speaking to my children. "Hello, dear." "Mom, there's some kind of mistake with my card," he began without preamble, his voice tightly controlled but with an undercurrent of panic. "I was just trying to pay for dinner with clients and it was declined." "Oh?" I kept my voice neutral. "That's strange." "Yes, it's extremely inconvenient. I had to use my personal card, which doesn't have the same reward structure for business expenses. Can you call the company and sort it out?" "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Alexander," I said, taking a sip of my tea. "I froze all the additional cards on my account." The silence was so complete I could hear the ambient restaurant noise on his end. Clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the soft notes of whatever jazz standard played in the background, of what was clearly an expensive establishment. What?" he finally managed. "I reviewed my accounts after our conversation Sunday. I noticed some unusual spending patterns and decided to temporarily suspend the cards until I could discuss it with each of you." His breathing changed, became more controlled, more deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to what I'd come to think of as his handling mom tone, patient, over-enunciated, as if speaking to someone who might not grasp complex concepts. "Mom, those cards are for your benefit. We use them for expenses related to helping you. I think you might be confused about the $12,400 payment to Craig Winters," I interrupted gently. "Was that for my benefit as well?" Another silence, longer this time. That's a business expense. I've been consulting with him about your situation. He's extremely well respected in financial management for seniors." "Fascinating," I said. "Did Craig happen to mention that paying him a retainer from someone else's credit account without their knowledge is potentially fraud?" "Mom!" His voice rose sharply before he caught himself. I could imagine him looking around the restaurant, making sure his clients couldn't overhear. "This is exactly why we're concerned. You're confused. That card is for family expenses, and helping you is a family expense." "I see," I said, still calm. "And the $3,700 at Nordstrom last month? The weekend at the Ritz-Carlton in Dallas? The new patio furniture delivered to your address? Were those all for my benefit, too?" His breathing became audible again. "Mom, I think we need to have this conversation in person. You're obviously not understanding how these accounts are structured. Why don't I come over tomorrow and we can go through everything together? I'll bring the statements and show you. That won't be necessary, I replied. I have all the statements, and I understand perfectly how the accounts are structured, since I set them up myself 20 years ago. What I'd like to understand is why you felt entitled to spend over $30,000 of my money in the past year while simultaneously suggesting I'm incapable of managing my own finances. $30,000, that's ridiculous. You're exaggerating again. This is exactly why. The total across all three of your cards is $31,840, 77 since last May, I said, glancing at the notepad where I'd written the exact figure. I have the statements itemized by purchase category if you'd like me to continue. The silence now had a different quality. Less shocked, more calculating. I could almost hear the gears turning as he tried to formulate his next approach. Mom? He finally said, his voice softening with forced compassion. I think you might be having one of your episodes. Remember last Christmas when you got confused about the gift certificates? Maybe you should call Melissa to come stay with you tonight. I'll drive up first thing tomorrow and we can sort this all out. The Christmas incident he referred to had been nothing more than a mix-up with gift card envelopes. A simple mistake anyone could make. But he'd seized on it, transformed it into evidence of my supposed decline, referenced it repeatedly in conversations with his siblings. That won't be necessary either, I said. I've already discussed the situation with Eleanor. Who's Eleanor? The confusion in his voice was genuine. Eleanor Washburn, my attorney. Now the silence had a distinctly different flavor, alarm, perhaps even fear. Your attorney? Mom, why would you need an attorney to discuss family finances? This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior we're worried about. Is it paranoid to consult legal counsel when I discover unauthorized spending of my money? Is it paranoid to question why my son is receiving kickbacks from a financial advisor he wants to control my assets? Tell me, Alexander, what would you call it? Kickbacks? Mom, that's insane. Craig is a colleague. The payment was for consultation services regarding your estate planning. I was trying to help you. By paying him from my credit card without my knowledge or consent? I was going to discuss it with you. I just wanted to secure his services before he took on new clients. He's very sought after. I'm sure he is, I said. Eleanor found his disciplinary record with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority quite interesting. Another long pause. When Alexander spoke again, his voice had lost its patronizing gentleness. Instead, it carried an edge of desperation. Mom, please, let's not involve lawyers. This is a family matter. I admit I should have discussed the consultant fee with you first, but everything I've done has been to protect you and your assets. You know how much I care about you. I do know that, I said softly, and I meant it. Despite everything, I knew my son loved me. But love and respect were different things entirely. Which is why this is so disappointing. What exactly are you planning to do? The question came out strained, tense. I haven't decided yet, I answered truthfully. For now, the cards will remain frozen. I'll be reviewing all transactions from the past 2 years with Eleanor and Frank. Frank? Who's Frank? Frank Chen, my financial advisor. You have a financial advisor? The disbelief in his voice would have been comical under different circumstances. For 15 years now, Howard and I have always believed in professional financial management. But you never mentioned. You never asked, Alexander. You assumed. The conversation ended shortly after that. Alexander, realizing he had lost control of the narrative, mumbled something about needing to get back to his clients and promised to call me the next day. I wished him a pleasant evening and hung up, my hands still steady, my resolve strengthening. with each passing moment. Within the hour, my phone lit up with texts and calls from both Melissa and Timothy. Clearly, Alexander had reached out to enlist their support. I let their messages go to voicemail, their texts unanswered. Tomorrow would be soon enough to address the situation with all of them together. Tonight was for planning. I returned to my office and pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote "Family Financial Reset" in my neat penmanship. Below it, I began listing action items, not from a place of anger or revenge, but from a position of clarity I hadn't felt since Howard's death. This wasn't about punishing my children. It was about reestablishing truth, boundaries, and respect. As I worked through the night, organizing documents and preparing for the conversation ahead, I realized something that brought both sadness and determination. My children had underestimated me their entire lives. They'd seen only the mother who baked birthday cakes and bandaged skinned knees, never the woman who managed investment portfolios and negotiated business loans. They'd reduced me to a caricature of aging vulnerability, erasing decades of competence, with their assumptions. Tomorrow, they would meet Gertrude Blackwood, not just mom, but the woman who had quietly built and preserved the very wealth they now sought to control. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son had claimed I was too forgetful for money decisions, yet I had remembered every account, every transaction, every detail he'd hoped I'd overlook. Most importantly, I had remembered who held the actual power in this situation, and it wasn't the son who thought he was protecting his declining mother. It was the mother who had never declined at all. The morning sunlight streamed through my kitchen windows as I prepared for the family meeting I had called. Not at my dining room table this time, Alexander's preferred venue for his ambush, but at Eleanor Washburn's law office downtown. The neutral territory was deliberate. This wasn't a family squabble to be settled over tea and sympathy. It was a financial breach that required professional boundaries. I dressed with purpose that morning. A tailored navy pantsuit Howard had always said made me look like the business executive I might have been in another life, pearl earrings he'd given me on our 30th anniversary, and sensible but elegant low heels. Not the cozy cardigan and slacks Alexander might have expected his forgetful mother to wear. My appearance was part of the message I intended to deliver. As I drove myself downtown, another ability my children seemed to question lately, I rehearsed what I would say. Not from uncertainty, but to ensure I remained measured and clear. This conversation wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Restoration of truth, of boundaries, and most importantly, of respect. Eleanor met me in the lobby of her building, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, her handshake firm as always. We'd been friends for nearly 20 years, first meeting in a community theater production where we'd played sisters. The friendship had evolved naturally into a professional relationship after Howard's death, when I needed someone I could trust implicitly to handle legal matters. "They've all confirmed they're coming," she said as we walked toward the conference room, though Alexander tried to reschedule twice. "Of course he did," I replied. "He prefers to be the one setting meetings, not attending them." Eleanor's office occupied the 8th floor of one of Milford's few high-rise buildings, with views of the harbor that would have distracted me on any other day. The conference room was understated but impressive, a gleaming oval table, comfortable leather chairs, discreet art on the walls. A young paralegal had set out water, coffee, and a tray of pastries that would likely go untouched given the tension, awaiting us. "Frank should be here in about 15 minutes, Eleanor said, checking her watch. "Do you want to review anything before they arrive?" Frank Chen, my financial advisor, was bringing the complete documentation of my accounts, both those Alexander knew about, and the much more substantial ones he didn't. His presence was another strategic decision. This meeting needed expert voices beyond my own, not because I couldn't speak for myself, but because my children had proven they wouldn't listen when I did. "I think we're well prepared," I said, settling into a chair at the head of the table, another deliberate choice. Though, I admit, I didn't sleep much last night. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder gently. That's understandable. This isn't easy, confronting family like this. But Trudy, what they've done, particularly Alexander, it isn't just disrespectful. Some of it crosses into potentially actionable territory. I know, I said quietly. But they're still my children. She nodded, understanding the complex. Emotions at play. Just remember why we're here. This isn't punitive, it's corrective. Exactly, I agreed, drawing strength from her clarity. I heard them before I saw them. Melissa's rapid-fire speech, Timothy's measured responses, and Alexander's authoritative tone dominating both. The conference room door opened, and all three of my children filed in, their expressions a study in varying degrees of confusion, concern, and in Alexander's case, poorly concealed anger. Melissa reached me first, bending to kiss my cheek. Mom, what's going on? Alex said there's some kind of financial emergency? Her eyes darted to Eleanor, whom she recognized from garden club events, but clearly hadn't expected to see in this. Context. Timothy approached more cautiously, his doctor's eyes assessing me as if checking for signs of illness or distress. Are you okay, Mom? This seems pretty formal for a family discussion. Alexander remained standing, briefcase in hand, taking in the setting with narrowed eyes. Mom, you could have just told us you wanted to meet with your friend. There was no need for all this. He gestured vaguely at the conference room. Production. Eleanor isn't just my friend today, Alexander, I said calmly. She's here as my attorney. Please, all of you, sit down. We're still waiting for one more person. The shift in the room was immediate. Melissa's hand flew to her throat in a gesture so reminiscent of my own mother that it nearly made me smile, despite the circumstances. Timothy's professional demeanor faltered for a moment before he composed himself and took a seat across from me. Alexander remained standing the longest, his jaw working as if physically chewing over this unexpected development. Your attorney, he finally said, sinking into a chair. Mom, I thought we agreed to handle financial matters as a family. That was certainly your proposal, I replied evenly. I don't recall agreeing to it. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and Frank Chen entered, carrying a sleek leather portfolio similar to the one Alexander had brought to my house on Sunday. In his early 60s, Frank had the calm confidence of someone who had weathered multiple financial storms and helped his clients do the same. Sorry I'm a few minutes late, Trudy, he said, setting his portfolio on the table. Traffic on the, bridge was backed up. Not a problem, Frank. We were just getting started. I turned to my children. This is Frank Chen, my financial advisor. Frank, these are my children, Alexander, Melissa, and Timothy. The confusion on their faces deepened. Alexander recovered first, extending his hand automatically even as his expression hardened. Financial advisor? He repeated. Mom, you never mentioned having a financial advisor. There seem to be quite a few things I haven't mentioned, I said. Or perhaps more accurately, quite a few things you never asked about. Eleanor cleared. Her throat softly, a signal we had practiced. Perhaps we should begin. Mrs. Blackwood has asked me to facilitate this meeting regarding some financial concerns that have recently come to light. What kind of concerns? Timothy asked, his doctor's caution evident in his measured tone. Specifically, Eleanor continued, concerns about unauthorized use of Mrs. Blackwood's credit accounts, attempts to access and control her financial assets without proper authority, and a pattern of behavior suggesting an attempt to undermine her financial autonomy. Melissa gasped. Mom, what is she talking about? I met each of their gazes in turn, ending with Alexander, whose face had gone carefully blank, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when caught in a lie. I'm Talking about the credit cards tied to my accounts that have been used for personal expenses not related to my care or needs, I said. I'm talking about Alexander's attempts to gain access to accounts where he isn't an authorized user. And I'm talking about the collective narrative you've all seemed to adopt that I'm somehow incapable of managing my own money. This is ridiculous, Alexander said, his voice tight. Those cards were set up by Dad for family expenses. We've always used them that way. Frank cleared his throat. Actually, the auxiliary cards in question were issued 3 weeks after Mr. Blackwood's death, with Mrs. Blackwood as the sole guarantor. I watched Alexander's confidence falter slightly as he realized there would be no hiding behind convenient half-truths. The documentation would show exactly when each card was issued, what it had been used for, and who had authorized the charges. Furthermore, Eleanor added, opening a folder, we have documentation of at least 17 attempts to access accounts at Meridian Bank and Coastal Investment Group, using Howard Blackwood's social security number and personal information in the past 6 months. The attempts were flagged by their security systems. Timothy's head snapped toward Alexander. You did what? Alexander's face flushed. I was trying to consolidate information for tax purposes. Dad made me executor of his will. I have a responsibility to manage the estate properly. Your father's estate was settled 2 years ago, I said quietly. There is no estate to manage anymore, Alexander. There are only my personal accounts, which you have no legal right to access. Mom, Melissa interjected, her voice wavering. We were just trying to help. You seemed so overwhelmed after Dad died, and you kept forgetting things, appointments, names, where you put things. I was grieving, I said simply, not declining. The room fell silent as the weight of that distinction settled over us. Grief and cognitive decline shared symptoms, but they were fundamentally different conditions. One healed with time. The other allegedly required the increasing control my children had been maneuvering to establish. Let me be very clear, I continued when no one spoke. I appreciate that you were concerned. I understand that watching a parent age can be frightening. But concern doesn't justify what's happened here. Frank opened his portfolio and removed a series of statements, passing copies to each person at the table. These are summaries of the auxiliary credit card transactions for the past 18 months, organized by cardholder and category of expense. My children looked down at the documents, and I watched realization dawn on each face. The evidence was irrefutable, laid out in neat columns and totals. Alexander's card, 47,002 on 16s, 78. Melissa's, 23,281s, 95. Timothy's, 16,309, 44. Every restaurant meal, clothing purchase, hotel stay, and service fee cataloged in black and white. Mom, Timothy began, his face pale, I can explain the medical conference charges. I thought that you were entitled to use my credit for your professional development because someday you might need to manage my health care. I finished. For him. That's the problem, Timothy. All of you have been making decisions based on a future version of me that doesn't exist yet, and may never exist. What about the money we've spent caring for you? Alexander demanded, recovering some of his confidence. The time we've taken off work, the travel expenses to check on you, the countless hours spent researching care options. Is that how you justify the chartered fishing trip to Montauk last summer? I asked, pointing to a $3,800 charge on his statement. Or perhaps the spa weekend in the Berkshires was for my benefit as well. I directed this to Melissa, who had the grace to look ashamed. Those were isolated incidents, Alexander insisted. Exceptions in an otherwise legitimate use of family resources. Family resources, I repeated slowly. That's an interesting choice of words for my personal credit accounts. Mom, Melissa tried again, tears forming in her eyes. We never meant to take advantage. It just evolved this way. After Dad died, You told us to use the cards for anything we needed. I said to use them for emergencies and expenses related to helping me, I corrected gently. Not for luxury items, not for business development, and certainly not for paying a financial advisor I never authorized or met. Alexander stiffened at this last point, and I knew we'd reached the crux of the issue. Craig Winters, I said, watching my son's face carefully. The advisor you paid a $1,200 retainer from my credit card. The same advisor you insisted needed to take control of my finances. He's highly qualified, Alexander said defensively. His firm specializes in estate management for seniors. He was disciplined by FINRA in 2018 for unauthorized trading in client accounts, Eleanor interjected smoothly, and again in 2021 for failure to disclose conflicts of interest regarding referral fees. That was a minor technical violation, Alexander insisted. Every advisor has had some kind of compliance issue. Frank raised an eyebrow, but remained professional. I've been in practice for 32 years without a single disciplinary action. The point, I said, steering us back to the central issue, is not whether Mr. Winters is qualified. The point is that you paid him with my money without my knowledge or consent, while simultaneously suggesting I wasn't competent to make my own financial decisions. The room fell silent again, the magnitude of what Alexander had done finally visible to everyone present. Timothy stared at his brother with naked disbelief, while Melissa seemed to be shrinking into her chair. What exactly are you planning to do, Mom? Timothy finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the same question Alexander had asked on the phone, but coming from Timothy, always my most sensitive child, it carried different weight. He wasn't asking about legal consequences. He was asking if our family could recover from this breach. That depends largely on what happens in this room today, I said, my voice softening slightly. I've taken some initial steps. The auxiliary credit cards have been permanently canceled. I've changed access protocols on all my accounts, and I've updated my estate planning documents with Eleanor's help. Alexander's head jerked up at this last point, and I knew he was calculating the potential impact on his inheritance. Always. The businessman, my eldest. I'm not interested in punishing any of you, I continued. I'm interested in reestablishing truth and boundaries. So here's what I propose. Each of you will repay the personal expenses charged to my accounts on a schedule we can work out individually based on your circumstances. All of it? Melissa asked, looking overwhelmed by her total. All of it, I confirmed. With two exceptions, legitimate expenses related to my care or household, and any charges more than 3 years old. I'm not interested in nickel and diming. Over a lunch from 2019. Timothy nodded slowly. That seems fair. Alexander remained silent, his expression unreadable. Additionally, I continued, we need to address the underlying issue that brought us here. You've been operating under the assumption that I need increasing levels of supervision and control. I don't. What I need is respect for my autonomy and recognition of my capabilities. Mom, Alexander finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. We recognize you're still independent in many ways, but you have to admit there have been concerning incidents. The Christmas mix-up, the time you got lost driving to Melissa's new apartment, the unpaid insurance bill that nearly caused your policy to lapse. All true, I acknowledged. I've made mistakes, as all humans do, but 3 incidents over 3 years don't constitute a pattern of decline. They constitute being human at 67. How do we move forward from here? Timothy asked, ever the pragmatist. With clarity and honesty, I said. I'm proposing quarterly family meetings, real ones, not ambushes, where I update you on my financial situation, health status, and any changes to my long-term plans. In return, I expect you to respect the boundaries I establish and to approach me as a competent adult, not a child to be managed." Melissa nodded immediately, eager for reconciliation. Timothy considered for a moment before agreeing as well. Alexander remained silent, his jaw working as he absorbed the shift in power dynamics. "What about access to your accounts?" he finally asked. "If something does happen to you, a health emergency, an accident, how will we manage things?" It was a fair question, one I had anticipated. "Frank has prepared a document outlining the existing safeguards," I said, nodding to my advisor. "I have proper powers of attorney in place, both financial and medical. Timothy already has the medical one, as he's best equipped to understand healthcare decisions." Timothy looked surprised. I had updated this document quietly last year without telling him, knowing he would handle the responsibility ethically if ever needed. "And the financial power of attorney?" Alexander asked, the edge in his voice suggesting he already knew the answer wouldn't be him. "Is held jointly by Eleanor and Frank," I said, "with specific triggering conditions that require medical certification before it becomes active." The blow landed exactly as I expected. Alexander had assumed he would naturally control my finances if I became incapacitated, an assumption based partly on his role as eldest son and partly on his professional background in business. Learning that I had placed this responsibility with trusted professionals instead of family clearly stung. "So, you don't trust any of us with your money," he said flatly. "I trust professionals to make professional decisions," I corrected. "Just as I would trust Timothy to make medical decisions based on his expertise. This isn't about trust as family, it's about appropriate roles and qualifications." "And what about the estate plan changes you mentioned?" he pressed. "Eleanor?" interjected smoothly. "The specific details of Mrs. Blackwood's updated estate plan are confidential at this time. She has indicated she's willing to discuss general principles during your quarterly family meetings, but the documents themselves remain private until she chooses to share them." Alexander's face darkened. "So we're being kept in the dark about our own inheritance?" "An inheritance is a gift, not an entitlement," I said quietly. "And it reflects the relationship between the giver and receiver." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable. My estate plan now reflected the reality of how my children had treated me, not just the fact of their biological connection to me. Melissa began to cry softly, while Timothy stared at his hands, visibly processing everything that had transpired. Alexander's face had gone from flushed to pale, the full consequences of his actions finally registering. "Mom," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "you know I never meant to take advantage. I was just trying to protect what Dad built for all of us. What your father and I built together," I corrected gently. "And what I've continued to preserve and grow since his death." Frank chose this moment to distribute another document, a simple chart showing the performance of my investment portfolio over the past 3 years compared to relevant market benchmarks. The line tracking my accounts consistently outperformed the comparison indices. "Mrs. Blackwood has not only maintained her financial position since Mr. Blackwood's passing," Frank explained, "but she's actually increased the overall portfolio value by approximately 14%, adjusted for withdrawals and inflation." Timothy studied the chart with professional interest. "That's impressive. Better than my retirement accounts have done." "Mom has always been good with money," Melissa said softly, a memory seemingly surfacing. "Remember how she always found a way to make Christmas special even in the lean years when Dad's business was struggling?" "That wasn't magic," I said with a sad smile. "That was careful planning, strategic saving, and knowing exactly where every dollar needed to go." Alexander was still staring at the performance chart, something shifting in his expression. Perhaps, for the first time, he was seeing me not just as his mother, but as a capable financial manager in my own right. "I'd like to propose we take a short break," Eleanor suggested, sensing the emotional weight in the room. Perhaps 15 minutes to process what we've discussed so far? Everyone agreed, seemingly grateful for the respite. As my children filed, out to find coffee or fresh air, Frank leaned toward me. "You're doing great, Trudy," he said quietly. "This isn't easy, but it's necessary." "I know," I replied. "I just hope they can understand that this isn't about punishing them. It's about reclaiming myself." The repayment plan was a master stroke, Eleanor added. Concrete consequences without being vindictive. I smiled wryly. Howard always said I could have been a diplomat in another life. When my children returned, something had shifted. They entered not as a unified front, but as individuals, each carrying their own reactions to what they'd learned. Timothy came first, sitting down beside me rather than across the table. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said simply. "I should have asked more questions instead of making assumptions." Melissa followed, her eyes red but her composure restored. She didn't speak immediately, just reached for my hand and squeezed it, our familiar gesture of connection since she was small. Alexander was the last to return, his face composed but his body language less commanding than before. He took his seat and looked at me directly. "I'd like to see the complete list of charges they're claiming I need to repay," he said, his tone businesslike but not combative. "I want to go through it line by line." "Of course," I agreed. "Frank has prepared itemized statements for each of you." Frank distributed the detailed records, and we spent the next hour in a strangely methodical review of 3 years of financial transgressions. There were occasional disputes. Alexander insisted certain restaurant charges were for meetings about my financial situation. Melissa argued that some shopping expenses had included items for my home, but largely they accepted the evidence before them. By early afternoon, we had established repayment plans for each child, signed agreements drafted by Eleanor, and established ground rules for our future quarterly meetings. As we prepared to conclude, I felt both emotionally drained and strangely liberated. The truth, however painful, was finally acknowledged. "Before we end," I said, gathering my strength for one final important point, "I want to be clear about something. I love each of you, unconditionally and completely. Nothing that happened here today changes that. But love and respect are different things, and the respect between us needed restoration." Timothy nodded immediately. Melissa wiped away a fresh tear. Alexander looked at me for a long moment before responding. "I still think you're making a mistake not consolidating your accounts," he said, a shadow of his former certainty still present. "But it's your decision to make. I can accept that." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of my autonomy, perhaps the most Alexander could offer today. I would take it as a beginning. As we gathered our belongings, Melissa approached me, her voice low so only I could hear. "Mom, I'd still like to come visit this weekend if that's okay. Not to check up on you," she added hastily, "just to spend time together." "I'd like that," I said sincerely. "Maybe we can finally try that new cafe downtown." "My treat," she said with meaning, and I smiled. Timothy hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering, "I'm proud of you," in my ear. A curious reversal of parent and child that somehow felt right in the moment. Alexander shook hands with Frank and Eleanor with professional courtesy, then stood awkwardly before me. "We'll talk soon," he said, not quite a question. "We will," I confirmed. "And Alexander? Next time you're concerned about something, just ask me directly. No more assumptions." He nodded once, then turned to go. I watched my 3 children walk out together, their body language telling a story of recalibration, of relationships, shifting into new configurations that would take time to fully settle. Eleanor touched my arm gently. "You did what needed to be done, Trudy. Not every mother would have had the courage." Not every mother had to learn to balance ledgers while raising 3 children, I replied with a small smile. Howard always said my backbone was made of steel underneath all the nurturing. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of both exhaustion and peace. The confrontation had been painful but necessary, like lancing a wound to allow healing to begin. My children had seen me, truly seen me, perhaps for the first time since Howard's death. Not as a diminishing shadow of myself, but as a woman of substance and capability who happened to also be their mother. The house was quiet when I returned, filled with the particular stillness that follows emotional storms. I changed out of my business attire into comfortable slacks and a soft sweater, then made myself a cup of tea and carried it out to the porch swing Howard had built decades ago. As I settled into the gentle rhythm of the swing, I noticed the garden needed attention. The rose bushes required pruning, and a few weeds had taken hold near the fence. Tomorrow, I would tend to them, my hands in the earth, continuing the work of nurturing and maintaining what Howard and I had built together. For today, though, I would simply sit here, watching the afternoon light shift across our yard, secure in the knowledge that I had remembered exactly who I was. Not just a mother, not just a widow, but Gertrude Blackwood, a woman who knew her own mind and the precise value of everything she had earned. The weeks following the meeting at Eleanor's office passed in a strange limbo of awkward phone calls and careful text messages. My children were recalibrating, trying to find the right balance between concern and respect, between staying connected and giving me space. I allowed this adjustment period, understanding that relationships built on decades of certain dynamics don't transform overnight. What mattered was that the first steps had been taken. Alexander, predictably, was the most distant. His weekly calls had always been perfunctory check-ins, efficient and brief, like everything else in his carefully managed life. Now they were even shorter, with an underlying tension neither of us directly addressed. He had begun making the agreed payments to my account, precisely on the schedule established, neither early nor late. Each transaction arrived with the same memo line, reimbursement per agreement, no personal message, no acknowledgement of the circumstances, just business. Melissa, by contrast, seemed determined to rebuild our relationship through sheer force of presence. She visited twice in the first week after our meeting, bringing homemade bread the first time and fresh flowers the second. Her conversation carefully avoided financial topics, focusing instead on her work, her friends, memories of her childhood. During her third visit, as we walked through the farmer's market together, she suddenly stopped beside a display of honey jars. "Remember when Dad kept bees that one summer?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips. I laughed, the memory vivid and welcome. 3 hives in the back corner of the yard. He was so proud of those bees until he realized he was allergic to the stings. But he wouldn't give them up, she continued. He just wore that ridiculous full-body suit in 90-degree heat. Your father was nothing if not stubborn once he committed to something, I said, selecting a jar of local wildflower honey. But the honey was worth it. Melissa's smile faltered slightly. I didn't realize until our meeting how much you both managed together. All these years, I thought. That your father handled the money and I handled the home? I suggested gently when she trailed off. She nodded, looking embarrassed. It sounds so outdated when you put it that way. It was the narrative you grew up with, I said. Not because we told you that directly, but because it was the visible part of our partnership you observed. You saw your father go to work each day. You saw me managing the household. The nights we spent at the kitchen table reviewing investments or adjusting our financial strategy happened after you were in bed. I feel like I never really knew the whole of either of you, she said quietly. No child ever does, I replied. Parents are people before they're parents, with histories and capabilities and dimensions their children rarely see completely. Melissa considered this as we continued through the market. "Mom," she said after a while, "did you ever feel resentful that Dad got the credit for the financial stability you both created?" The question surprised me with its insight. Sometimes, I admitted, especially when his colleagues would make comments at dinner parties about how lucky Howard was to have a wife who didn't worry her pretty head about money. I smiled at the memory of those insufferable gatherings. But your father always corrected them. He never took credit for my contributions. "Unlike us," Melissa said softly. I squeezed her hand, accepting the indirect apology. "We learn and grow. That's all any of us can do." Timothy's approach to our new reality was the most straightforward. He called on Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after our meeting, and said simply, "I've scheduled the transfer for the full amount, Mom. It should be in your account by Friday." "The full amount?" I repeated, surprised. We had established a 6-month payment plan for his balance, recognizing that even with his doctor's salary, the lump sum was substantial. "Timothy, that wasn't necessary. The payment plan was reasonable." "Maybe," he said, "but it doesn't feel right to drag it out. I used funds I shouldn't have used. The sooner it's made right, the better for both of us." His directness was refreshing, so characteristic of his approach to life. While Alexander calculated and Melissa emoted, Timothy had always assessed situations clearly and acted decisively. "Thank you," I said simply. "Mom," he continued after a brief pause, "there's something else I wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about our quarterly family meetings." "Yes?" I prompted when he didn't immediately continue. "I think we should include spouses," he said. "Diane feels terrible about not realizing what was happening with the credit cards, and I think it would help prevent future misunderstandings if partners are part of these conversations. Transparency for everyone." I considered his suggestion. Diane, Timothy's wife of 15 years, had always been respectful of my autonomy. Alexander's wife, Vanessa, was more of an unknown quantity. Pleasant enough in social settings, but clearly deferential to Alexander in financial matters. And Melissa had been divorced for 3 years. "That seems reasonable for those who are married," I said carefully. "We'll need to establish clear guidelines about confidentiality, though. These discussions should remain within the immediate family." "Of course," Timothy agreed. "I just think it would help rebuild trust all around, and—" He hesitated briefly. "It would let the spouses see you the way we should have been seeing you all along." His insight touched me deeply. Timothy had always been my most observant child, the one who noticed subtleties others missed. Now he was suggesting a path toward broader family healing, one that acknowledged the ripple effects of our damaged dynamics. "We'll try it for the first quarterly meeting," I decided. "See how it goes." "Good," Timothy said, sounding relieved. "And Mom, I'm really sorry. For all of it. The assumptions, the card usage, not standing up to Alex when he started orchestrating everything. I should have known better." "Yes," I said, not unkindly but honestly. "You should have. But I should have established clearer boundaries from the beginning. We all contributed to how things evolved." After we hung up, I sat in Howard's old study, my office now, and reflected on these conversations with my children. Each was finding their way back to a relationship with me that was fundamentally different from before, one based on who I actually was rather than who they had assumed I had become. It was progress, messy and imperfect, but real. What I didn't anticipate was Alexander's next move. 3 weeks after our meeting, as I was deadheading roses in my garden, a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one Alexander had brought to our family meeting. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he called, approaching the garden gate. "Craig Winters. I believe you know of me through your son." The financial advisor Alexander had paid from my credit card stood before me, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. I straightened slowly, garden shears still in hand, and assessed him coolly. "Mr. Winters," I acknowledged without warmth. "This is unexpected." "I apologize for arriving without an appointment," he said smoothly, "but I felt our conversation was best had in person rather than over the phone." "Our conversation," I repeated. I wasn't aware we had anything to discuss. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Alexander suggested it might be beneficial for us to meet directly, clear the air, so to speak." "Did he?" I set my garden, shears on the nearby bench, and removed my gloves, taking my time. "And did my son mention that any financial discussions I have are now conducted through my advisor, Frank Chen?" Winter's expression flickered briefly before he recovered. "He did mention you're working with someone, yes, but I thought you might appreciate hearing directly about the specialized services my firm offers for clients in your situation." "My situation," I echoed, letting the words hang in the air between us. He shifted slightly, the first sign of discomfort breaking through his polished exterior. "Clients transitioning to retirement years who want to ensure their estate is properly structured for the next generation." "I see." I gestured toward the garden gate. "Why don't you come in, Mr. Winters? I think we should have this conversation properly." Relief crossed his face as he interpreted my invitation as acquiescence. He didn't realize I was simply moving. Our interaction away from the curious eyes of my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had paused her own gardening to watch our exchange with undisguised interest. I led him to the patio rather than inside the house, another deliberate choice. This was not a social call deserving hospitality, nor a professional consultation warranting privacy. It was an unwelcome intrusion that required a clear but contained response. "Please, sit." I indicated one of the wrought iron chairs Howard and I had purchased for our 30th anniversary, a matching set that had weathered beautifully over the years. I took the opposite seat, folding my hands in my lap. "Now, Mr. Winters, let's be direct with each other. Why are you really here?" He placed his portfolio on the table between us. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand there's been some misunderstanding about the consultation fee your son arranged. I want to assure you that my firm operates with the highest ethical standards." "The fee isn't the issue," I said calmly. "The issue is that neither you nor my son had any authority to establish a professional relationship using my funds without my knowledge or consent." "Of course," he said quickly. "That's precisely why I'm here. To establish that relationship properly, directly with you. Alexander spoke highly of your financial acumen, and I believe my services would complement your existing approach." The lie was so transparent it was almost laughable. Alexander had described me to this man as declining, forgetful, in need of supervision, not as someone with financial acumen. This reversal revealed exactly what kind of advisor Craig Winters was, and exactly why Alexander had chosen him. "Mr. Winters," I said, my voice cooling several degrees, "I find your approach concerning. You accepted payment from a third party for services related to my finances without ever speaking to me. You're now at my home, uninvited, attempting to establish a client relationship after I've made it clear I work with another advisor. And you appear to be deliberately misrepresenting previous conversations with my son." His confident expression faltered. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think you're misinterpreting." "I don't believe I am." I rose from my seat, signaling the end of our conversation. "I suggest you return the retainer payment my son made using my credit card, as it was unauthorized. Should you choose not to do so, my attorney will be contacting you directly to resolve the matter." He stood as well, his facade of friendly professionalism crumbling. "Alexander indicated you might be difficult, but refusing professional financial guidance at your age is simply irresponsible." "My age," I repeated softly. "Mr. Winters, how old do you think I am?" He faltered, clearly realizing he'd stepped onto dangerous ground. Wouldn't presume to guess. I'm 67, I said. Hardly ancient. But even if I were 97, my age alone wouldn't determine my financial competence. Of course not, he backpedaled. I only meant that as we mature, our financial needs evolve, requiring specialized expertise. Like yours? I asked with deliberate skepticism. His expression hardened. Mrs. Blackwood, I've managed portfolios for clients with net worth significantly higher than yours for over 20 years. My track record speaks for itself. As does your disciplinary record with FINRA, I replied evenly. 2 citations in 3 years suggests either carelessness or a pattern of ethical shortcuts. Neither inspires confidence. The color drained from his face. Those were technical violations, minor paperwork issues That's not how the regulatory body described them, I interrupted. Now, I believe our conversation is concluded. Please see yourself out the same way you came in. He gathered. His portfolio with stiff movements, his earlier smoothness replaced by barely contained anger. Alexander was right about one thing, he said as he turned to leave. You're too stubborn for your own good. I watched him walk back to his car, his posture rigid with indignation. Only when he had driven away did I allow myself a moment of pure, unadulterated fury. Not at Craig Winters, he was merely a symptom, but at Alexander, who had sent him here knowing exactly what kind of man he was. This wasn't an olive branch or an attempt at reconciliation. It was another effort to undermine me, to wear down my resistance through persistence. My son had apparently learned nothing from our confrontation. I pulled out my phone and called Eleanor immediately, explaining what had just occurred. That's aggressive, she said, her voice sharp with professional concern. Sending an advisor to your home after you've explicitly established boundaries is inappropriate at best. And at worst? I asked, though I already knew the answer. At worst, it's an escalation, Trudy. A sign that Alexander isn't willing to accept the new reality we established. I sighed, rubbing my temple where a headache was beginning to form. What do you suggest? 2 things, she said decisively. First, I'll send a formal letter to Mr. Winters demanding the return of the retainer and clearly stating that any further contact with you will be considered harassment. Second, I think we need to revisit your security measures. Security. Measures? I repeated. Eleanor, this is uncomfortable, but I don't feel physically threatened. Not physical security, she clarified. Financial and legal security. If Alexander is willing to send Winters to your home, he may be willing to take other steps to regain control. We should ensure all your accounts have additional verification protocols in place, and I'd like to add a specific codicil to your advanced directives regarding financial decision-making capacity. The implications of her suggestion settled over me like a cold fog. She was suggesting that my own son might attempt to have me declared incompetent to manage my affairs if he couldn't convince me to surrender control voluntarily. Do you really think he would go that far? I asked quietly. Her silence before answering told me everything. I think, she finally said, that when people are accustomed to control, they rarely relinquish it easily. And financial control can be particularly difficult to surrender. I'm not saying he would definitely attempt something so drastic, but I believe in preparing for worst-case scenarios while hoping for better outcomes. After we ended the call, I sat on the patio for a long time, watching shadows lengthen across my garden as the afternoon progressed toward evening. The roses I'd been tending earlier swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the golden light. Howard had planted those bushes for our 25th anniversary, selecting varieties that would bloom in succession throughout the season, so I would always have fresh flowers. You deserve beauty that renews itself, he had said, presenting me with the first cutting from the garden. I thought about renewal now, about how relationships could either regenerate or wither depending on how they were tended. Alexander and I were at a crossroads. His decision to send Craig Winters to my home suggested he was choosing a path of continued control rather than renewed respect. I needed to respond decisively, but without permanently damaging what remained of our relationship. The balance would be delicate, requiring both firmness and compassion, the same approach I'd used when he was a headstrong teenager testing boundaries, though the stakes were considerably higher now. The next morning, I called Timothy first, knowing his medical schedule made early conversations easier than evening ones. "Did you know Alexander sent Craig Winters to my house yesterday?" I asked after our initial greetings. Timothy's shocked silence was genuine. "He did what? Mom, I had no idea." "No, that's completely inappropriate." "Yes, it was," I agreed. "And concerning, given everything we discussed at Eleanor's office." "What did Winters want?" Timothy asked. "Ostensibly, to convince me to become a client directly. But the subtext was clear. Alexander is still trying to influence my financial decisions just through different channels." Timothy's sigh carried a weight of frustration. "I'm sorry, Mom. I thought he understood after our meeting, but clearly—" He trailed off, then asked, "Have you spoken to him about it?" "Not yet," I admitted. I wanted to get a sense of whether this was something you and Melissa knew about first. "Absolutely not," Timothy said firmly. "And I'm certain Melissa doesn't know either. She would have told me if Alexander was planning something like this." I believed him. Despite their differences, my children had always maintained a certain solidarity with each other, sharing significant information even when they disagreed on approaches or outcomes. "I'll talk to him," Timothy offered. "Before you do, sometimes he hears things differently from me than from you or Melissa." I considered his offer carefully. On one hand, I didn't want to create divisions among my children or turn this into a situation where they felt they needed to take sides. On the other hand, Timothy's medical background gave him credibility on matters related to capacity and competence that might impact Alexander's thinking. "All right," I agreed. "But don't approach it as a confrontation. Just explore his thinking. Try to understand why he thought sending Winters was an appropriate next step." "Will do," Timothy promised. "And Mom, you might want to check your email. I sent you something last night that I think you'll find interesting." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and found Timothy's email. The subject line read simply, "Found in Dad's desk." Inside was a scanned image of a handwritten letter in Howard's distinctive penmanship, dated just 2 months before his death. "My dearest Trudy," it began. "As I organize my papers, I realize there are things I've never properly acknowledged in writing, though I hope I've expressed them adequately in our life together. Chief among them is my profound gratitude for your financial stewardship of our family's resources." The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing specific investment decisions I had made over the years, strategies I had researched and implemented, and the overall impact of my management on our family's financial health. Howard's words were precise, informed, and deeply appreciative. This wasn't a generic love letter. It was a specific accounting of my contributions by someone who understood exactly what they had meant to our shared life. "Without your careful guidance," Howard concluded, "the security we enjoy today would not exist. The children may believe my business acumen built our nest egg, but you and I know the truth. I earned, but you multiplied. My only regret is that I allowed others to assume otherwise for too long. I hope this letter serves as a small correction to that oversight. All my love, always, Howard." Tears blurred my vision as I read his words. Howard had never been demonstrative in the ways that made for romantic stories. He brought home practical gifts rather than flowers, expressed love through actions rather than poetry. But he had seen me, truly seen me, and valued what he saw. I wondered briefly why Timothy had only found this now, 3 years after Howard's death. Then I remembered that Alexander had been the one to clean out Howard's desk initially, sorting his papers and personal effects. Had he seen this letter and deliberately kept it from me? Or had it been tucked away in some folder he hadn't explored thoroughly? Either way, Timothy had found it now, in some file or box he'd recently revisited, and had immediately recognized its significance. Not just as a personal memento, but as a contemporaneous document written by Howard himself that directly contradicted the narrative Alexander had constructed about my financial capabilities. I forwarded the scanned letter to Eleanor with a brief note asking her to keep it on file. It might never be needed for any legal purpose, but having Howard's explicit acknowledgement of my financial role in our marriage could prove valuable if Alexander's resistance escalated further. Melissa called that afternoon, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. "Mom? Tim told me about Alexander sending that financial advisor to your house. I just wanted to check that you're okay." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I assured her, annoyed but not distressed. "I don't understand why he would do that," she said, frustration evident in her tone. "After everything we discussed at the meeting, after you made it so clear, it's like he wasn't even in the same room with the rest of us." Her assessment was perceptive. Alexander had indeed seemed to experience a different meeting than the rest of us, one where he had merely suffered a temporary setback rather than a fundamental shift in family dynamics. "Your brother has always been stubborn," I said, trying to maintain balanced perspective. "And he genuinely believes he's acting in my best interest, however misguided his methods." "That's generous of you," Melissa said, a hint of her old spark returning. "I'd say he's being a controlling jerk who can't stand not getting his way." I laughed despite myself. "Well, there's probably some truth in that assessment, too." "Tim's talking to him tonight," she continued. "He thinks Alexander might listen to him since they share that whole rational men making logical decisions vibe they've had since they were kids." "We'll see," I said, not entirely convinced but willing to give Timothy's approach a chance. "In the meantime, how are you doing with everything else? Are you finding the repayment plan manageable?" There was a brief pause before Melissa answered. "Actually, that's partly why I called. I've been thinking about how to handle this, and I'd like to propose an alternative arrangement." My guard instantly rose. "What kind of alternative?" "I can make the payments as agreed," she said quickly, sensing my concern. "But I'd also like to contribute something more meaningful than just money. I was thinking, what if I helped you digitize all your financial records, create a secure system that only you control, but that would be easier to maintain and monitor?" Her suggestion surprised me. Of all my children, Melissa had shown the least interest in financial matters, focusing her talents on creative pursuits instead. She worked as a graphic designer, had a good eye for aesthetics, but had always claimed to be hopeless with numbers. "That's thoughtful," I said cautiously, "but I'm not sure I need help with that. My system works well for me." "I know," she said, "but I've been learning about digital security for a client project, a financial services firm that needed their customer portal redesigned. It got me thinking about how vulnerable paper records can be to damage or loss, and how digital systems, when properly secured, can actually provide better protection." Her reasoning was sound, and I appreciated that she had approached this as an offer rather than a criticism or demand. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "Nothing that would change how you manage anything," she clarified. "Just creating digital backups of important documents, setting up secure cloud storage that only you can access, maybe streamlining some of the record keeping. I could teach you how it all works, step by step, so you're not dependent on anyone else to maintain it." I considered her proposal. Unlike Alexander's attempts to take control, Melissa was offering a genuine skill share that would preserve my autonomy while potentially improving my system's resilience. It showed both respect for my capabilities and a desire to contribute, something of value beyond mere repayment. "I'd like to think about it," I said finally. "It's a generous offer, but I want to be sure it's something I actually need before accepting." "Of course," she said, sounding relieved that I hadn't dismissed the idea outright. There's no rush. And Mom, I really am sorry about everything. I should have been paying more attention instead of just going along with what Alexander said about your situation. We all made mistakes, I said gently. What matters is how we move forward. After hanging up, I returned to my garden, needing the grounding presence of living things growing in orderly rows. The physical work of weeding and pruning had always helped me think, the repetitive motions freeing my mind to process complex problems without distraction. Timothy called again that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. I spoke with Alexander, he said without preamble. It didn't go well. What happened? I asked, settling into my reading chair, prepared for an unpleasant report. He doesn't see the problem with sending Winters to your house, Timothy explained. He said, and I quote, Mom needs to hear from professionals, not just family, about how she's putting her financial security at risk. When I reminded him that you already work with a financial advisor, he dismissed Frank as some local guy, who's probably in over his head with a portfolio that size. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this information. Did he acknowledge that sending someone to my home without warning was inappropriate? No, Timothy said flatly. He said Winters is exactly the kind of proactive advisor Mom needs. And that if you'd just meet with him properly, you'd see he's right. I see, I said, disappointment settling in my chest. And did he have anything to say about the authorization issue? About Winters accepting payment from my credit card without my knowledge? Timothy's sigh carried through the phone line. He thinks because he's your son, and because he's been helping with various matters since Dad died, he had implicit authority to arrange these services for you. When I pointed out that's not how legal or financial responsibility works, he said, I was getting caught up in technicalities. The conversation Timothy described confirmed my worst fears about Alexander's perspective. He truly believed he had the right, perhaps even the obligation, to override my autonomy if he disagreed with my decisions. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control and his perception of his role in my life. Thank you for trying, I said sincerely. I appreciate that you were willing to have that difficult conversation. Mom, Timothy said, his voice lowering slightly, there's something else you should know. When I pressed him on why he was so insistent about changing your financial arrangements, he mentioned that he's been counting on his inheritance to fund Emma and Jacob's college accounts. Emma and Jacob were Alexander's children, my grandchildren, currently 13 and 15 years old. The revelation stunned me momentarily into silence. He's been... What? I finally managed. Apparently, Timothy continued grimly, he's been operating under the assumption that his portion of your estate would be substantial enough to cover both kids' education. He's been telling Vanessa they don't need to worry about college savings because Mom's estate will handle it. The presumption was breathtaking. Not only had Alexander assumed control over my current finances, but he had also been making family planning decisions based on his anticipated inheritance. Money that wasn't his might not be available for years or decades, and that he had no guarantee would be directed to his children's education. That explains some of his urgency, I said, processing this new information. He's not just concerned about my management. He's concerned about protecting what he sees as his children's future resources. It's completely inappropriate, Timothy said, anger evident in his voice. Diane and I have been saving for Sophia's education since she was born. We'd never assume your estate would or should cover that expense. No, I agreed. You wouldn't. But Alexander has always had a different relationship with money than you or Melissa. Howard used to say Alexander never met a dollar he didn't want to leverage 3 different ways. It was true. From his first paper route earnings at 12 to his current executive position, Alexander had always been focused on maximizing financial advantage, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes recklessly. In his mind, My estate probably represented an untapped resource that should be optimized, not a personal legacy to be respected. "What are you going to do?" Timothy asked. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I need to address this directly. With him, not through intermediaries. This pattern can't continue." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, the only light coming from the small lamp beside my chair. The house felt especially quiet tonight, the absence of Howard's presence more acute than usual as I faced this difficult situation alone. Or not alone, I reminded myself. I had Eleanor's legal expertise, Frank's financial guidance, and the support of 2 of my 3 children. I had my own strength and clarity, and I had Howard's letter, his words a tangible reminder of his confidence in me. Tomorrow, I would call Alexander directly and request a meeting. Just the 2 of us, away from his office and mine, on truly neutral ground. No ambushes, no financial advisors, no siblings to mediate or support either side. Just mother and son, having the conversation we should have had 3 years ago when Howard died. It was time to address the root of the problem, not just its symptoms. Whatever happened next would determine not only the future of my financial autonomy, but the nature of my relationship with my eldest child for years to come. I chose the Harborview Cafe for my meeting with Alexander, a small establishment overlooking the marina where Howard and I used to enjoy Sunday brunches. It was public enough to encourage civility, but quiet enough for a private conversation. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner table with a view of the water and the arriving boats. The familiar sight of sails billowing in the breeze brought a momentary calm before the storm I anticipated. Alexander arrived precisely on time. 5 minutes early would have suggested eagerness, 5 minutes late disrespect. His punctuality had always been one of his more admirable traits. He wore a charcoal suit despite the summer heat, his corporate armor intact even for a conversation with his mother. "Mom," he said with a nod as he took the seat opposite me. His tone was neutral, his expression carefully composed. "Thank you for coming, Alexander," I replied, equally measured. "I thought it was time we spoke directly, just the 2 of us." He glanced around the cafe, taking in the nautical decor and the scattered patrons before returning his attention to me. "You picked one of Dad's favorites." "Yes," I acknowledged. Neutral territory seemed appropriate. A server approached, momentarily pausing our conversation as we ordered. Black coffee for Alexander, Earl Grey tea for me. Neither of us requested food. This wasn't a social occasion, it was a reckoning. Once we were alone again, I decided to address the issue directly rather than circling it with pleasantries. "You sent Craig Winters to my home." It wasn't a question, so Alexander didn't treat it as one. "I thought a direct meeting might help you see the value of his services. Sometimes professional perspectives carry more weight than family concerns." "What concerns me," I said evenly, "is that after our meeting at Eleanor's office, after all the documentation and discussion, you still felt entitled to make decisions about my financial management without consulting me." He shifted slightly in his chair, the only visible sign of discomfort. "I wasn't making decisions, Mom. I was facilitating an introduction." "An introduction I explicitly stated I didn't want or need," I countered. "An introduction to an advisor. With a disciplinary record who accepted payment from my credit card without my consent." "The retainer situation was unfortunate," Alexander conceded, though his tone suggested he considered it a minor technicality rather than a serious ethical breach. "But Craig's expertise is worth the investment. His clients consistently outperform market averages." "So do mine with Frank," I said simply. Alexander's expression shifted subtly, skepticism evident in the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Mom, with all due respect, Frank Chen is a small-town advisor with a limited client base. Craig manages portfolios for executives at firms twice the size of mine." And has been disciplined twice for ethical violations while doing so, I pointed out. But this conversation isn't really about Craig Winter's qualifications or lack thereof. It's about your continued attempts to control my finances despite my clear boundaries. Our drinks arrived, creating another brief interlude. Alexander used the moment to gather himself, his businessman's composure returning as the server departed. "I'm not trying to control you, Mom," he said, his voice softening with practiced sincerity. "I'm trying to protect your future, and by extension, our family's future." "Ah," I said, stirring my tea slowly. "That brings me to something else we need to discuss. Timothy mentioned that you've been counting on your inheritance to fund Emma and Jacob's college education." For the first time, genuine surprise flashed across Alexander's face, quickly replaced by defensiveness. "He shouldn't have shared that with you. It was a private conversation." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but it explains a great deal about your persistence in this matter. You're not just concerned about my financial management. You're concerned about protecting what you see as your children's future resources." Alexander's jaw tightened briefly before he responded. "Is it wrong to want to provide the best possible education for my children? Dad always said family was the most important investment. He would have wanted his grandchildren to have every advantage." "Your father would indeed have wanted that," I agreed. "But he would have expected you to plan for it yourself, not to count on an inheritance that might not materialize for decades." "Might not materialize?" Alexander repeated, his voice sharpening. "What exactly does that mean?" I took a sip of my tea, maintaining eye contact with my son over the rim of the cup. "It means several things, Alexander. First, that I'm only 67 and in good health, so any inheritance might be 30 years away. Second, that long-term care could potentially consume a significant portion of my assets if needed. And third, that my estate plan is mine to determine based on my values and relationships, not an entitlement you can count on for your financial planning." The color rose in Alexander's face, a sure sign that my words had struck home. "So you're threatening to disinherit us because I expressed concern about your financial management?" "I said nothing about disinheritance," I corrected calmly. "I'm simply pointing out that treating my assets as if they're already yours is both presumptuous and unwise financial planning on your part." "Dad would never have—" "Your father," I interrupted firmly, "left explicit instructions about how our assets should be managed after his death, instructions that acknowledged my financial expertise and autonomy." I reached into my handbag and withdrew a folder containing a copy of Howard's letter, which I placed on the table between us. "Timothy found this in your father's desk recently. I think you should read it." Alexander stared at the folder without touching it, wariness evident in his posture. "What is it?" "A letter your father wrote shortly before his death, one you either overlooked when clearing his desk or chose not to share with me." His expression flickered between several emotions: defensiveness, curiosity, and something that might have been guilt, before he finally opened the folder and began to read. I watched as his eyes moved across the page, his confident demeanor gradually faltering as Howard's words registered. "Dad wrote this?" he asked when he finished, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Yes," I confirmed. 2 months before he died." Alexander read the letter again, his brow furrowed. "I never saw this," he said finally. "It must have been filed away somewhere I didn't check." I studied him closely, trying to determine whether he was being truthful. Alexander had always been adept at crafting narratives that served his interests. But the genuine surprise in his expression suggested he was telling the truth about the letter. "Your father understood the value of my financial work," I said softly, even when others didn't recognize it. Alexander closed the folder slowly, his gaze fixed on some middle distance beyond our table. "I always thought Dad handled the big Financial decisions, he admitted. The investments, the retirement planning. He talked about those things with me occasionally, especially after I started my MBA. He discussed them with you because he was proud of your interest in business, I explained. But those conversations didn't reflect the full reality of our partnership. So, all these years, Alexander said, a note of disbelief entering his voice, when I assumed Dad was the financial strategist. We were a team, I said simply. Howard earned, I managed, we decided together. After he retired, we both managed, but I took the lead because I had more experience with our specific investment approach. Alexander was silent for a long moment, absorbing this revision to his long-held understanding of his parents' relationship. I could almost see him recalibrating, reconciling this new information with his existing worldview. Why didn't you ever say anything? He finally asked. When I started talking about helping you with finances after Dad died, why didn't you just tell me you'd been managing things all along? The question caught me off guard with its directness. I had asked myself the same thing many times over the past 3 years, wondering why I had allowed my children's assumptions to go unchallenged for so long. I suppose I thought it should have been obvious, I said after a moment's reflection. I never hid my involvement in our financial planning. But perhaps more importantly, I didn't feel I needed to justify my competence to my own children. I expected a certain baseline of respect and trust. Alexander flinched slightly at the implied criticism. I do respect you, Mom. No, Alexander, I said gently but firmly. You love me, but you haven't been respecting me. There's a difference. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again, seemingly unable to formulate a convincing rebuttal. Let me ask you something, I continued, taking advantage of his momentary silence. Why were you so quick to assume I was declining cognitively? What evidence, beyond normal aging and occasional forgetfulness that everyone experiences, made you so certain I needed intervention? Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There were incidents, he said defensively. The Christmas gift card mix-up, the time you got lost driving to Melissa's new apartment, the insurance bill that almost lapsed. 3 minor incidents over 3 years, I pointed out. Would you have drawn the same conclusion if it had been Vanessa who made those same mistakes, or one of your colleagues? Or would you have simply attributed them to normal human error? His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. The standard he had applied to me was different, harsher, less forgiving, more pathologizing, because of my age and my role as his mother. I was worried, he said finally. After Dad died, you seemed different, more forgetful, less focused. I thought it was the beginning of something worse. I was grieving, I reminded him gently. Grief affects memory, concentration, even physical health. It doesn't mean cognitive decline. Alexander nodded slowly, a grudging acknowledgement. Maybe I jumped to conclusions, he conceded. But Mom, you have to understand. Watching a parent age is terrifying. The thought of you struggling alone, or worse, being taken advantage of because Dad wasn't there to protect you. Your father never protected me from financial matters, I corrected, unable to keep a note of sharpness from my voice. He relied on my judgment, and I don't need protection now. I need respect for my autonomy and recognition of my capabilities. Our conversation paused as the server returned to refill Alexander's coffee. I used the moment to study my son, seeing beyond his polished exterior to the complex emotions beneath. Despite everything, I understood his concern came from a place of love, however misguided its expression had been. Alexander, I said once we were alone again, I want to propose a new arrangement between us. Not a financial one, but a relational one. He looked at me warily. What kind of arrangement? Transparency and honest communication, I said simply. If you're concerned about something specific regarding my health or finances, you come to me directly with questions instead of making assumptions. In return, I'll be open with you about any challenges I'm facing, including any difficulties that might actually warrant your assistance. That sounds reasonable, he said cautiously. And, I continued, we both acknowledge that loving someone doesn't give us the right to control them. It gives us the responsibility to respect their boundaries and support their autonomy. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering my words. And what about Craig Winters? What about him? I countered. Would you at least consider meeting with him professionally? Just one consultation to hear his perspective on your portfolio? I shook my head, disappointed but not surprised by his persistence. No, Alexander. I won't be meeting with Craig, Winters, or any other advisor you select. I have a trusted financial team in place, and I'm satisfied with their performance and approach. But how do you know they're giving you the best possible advice if you won't even compare alternatives? He pressed. The same way you know Vanessa is the right partner without dating every eligible woman in Connecticut, I replied dryly. Some things we choose based on trust, compatibility, and demonstrated reliability over time. Alexander's lips twitched, in what might have been the beginning of a reluctant smile. That's hardly the same thing. Isn't it? I challenged. We make choices about who to trust with the important aspects of our lives. I've chosen Frank Chen to advise me on financial matters and Eleanor Washburn for legal counsel. I'm not interested in alternatives, especially those presented with the implication that I'm incapable of making sound decisions on my own. He sighed, a sound of frustration, but also dawning acceptance. You're not going to change your mind about any of this, are you? No, I said simply. I'm not. Alexander nodded slowly, his expression shifting from frustration to something more resigned. So where does that leave us? That depends largely on you, I said honestly. I've established my boundaries. I've clarified my expectations. What happens next is determined by whether you choose to respect them or continue trying to circumvent them. And if I disagree with your decisions, if I genuinely believe you're making choices that could harm your financial future, then you expressed that concern directly to me one time, with specific evidence, I said. And when I make my decision after considering your input, you respect it, even if it's not what you would choose. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of Howard when faced with a problem he couldn't easily solve. That's going to be challenging for me. I know, I acknowledged. You've always preferred being in control, but our relationship can't heal unless you're willing to see me as an autonomous adult, rather than a responsibility to be managed. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't yet formulated. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his expression. Not complete acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. I'll try, he said simply. It wasn't an enthusiastic commitment, but it was honest. And with Alexander, honesty was often more reliable than performative enthusiasm. That's all I'm asking, I said. That you try, and that we keep talking, even when it's difficult. We finished our drinks in a silence that wasn't exactly comfortable, but was no longer hostile. As we prepared to leave, Alexander hesitated, then reached across the table to touch my hand briefly. Mom, he said, his voice softer than it had been throughout our conversation. I am sorry about the credit cards. That was inappropriate. The apology caught me by surprise, not because it wasn't warranted, but because Alexander rarely admitted wrongdoing directly. Thank you, I said simply. I appreciate that. We walked out of the cafe together, pausing in the sunshine beside the harbor. The water sparkled with afternoon light, boats bobbing gently at their moorings. Dad loved this view, Alexander commented, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did, I agreed. He said it reminded him that there are many paths to the same destination. Alexander glanced at me with a raised eyebrow. Are you getting philosophical on me, Mom? Just remembering your father's wisdom, I said with a small smile. He understood that controlling every variable isn't always the best approach. Sometimes you have to adjust your sails to the wind rather than trying to change its direction. I'm not sure I have Dad's patience for sailing metaphors, Alexander said, but there was a hint of warmth in his tone that had been absent earlier. You don't need patience for metaphors, I replied, just for relationships. As we parted ways in the parking lot, I felt a cautious optimism. Our conversation hadn't resolved everything, but it had begun to reset the foundation of our relationship. Alexander would likely always struggle with letting go of control, but at least now he had a clearer understanding of what was at stake, if he didn't. The drive home gave me time to reflect on our meeting and what might come next. Alexander would either respect the boundaries I'd established or he wouldn't. If he did, our relationship had a chance to heal and evolve into something more balanced. If he didn't, I was prepared to take more definitive action to protect my autonomy, even if it created greater distance between us. What I hadn't anticipated was the call that came from Melissa that evening, her voice tight with barely contained anger. Mom, did you know Alexander is telling the family that you might be changing your will to cut us out because of the credit card situation? The accusation stunned me momentarily into silence. What? When did he say this? He called Tim about an hour ago, then me right after, Melissa explained. He said you showed him some letter from Dad that made you rethink the entire estate plan, and that you basically threatened to disinherit everyone if we didn't back off about your finances. I closed my eyes, disbelief and disappointment washing over me in equal measure. After our conversation, after what I thought had been a breakthrough, Alexander had immediately twisted my words and actions to serve his own narrative. That's not what happened, I said firmly, and it's not what I said. I didn't think so, Melissa replied. It didn't sound like you at all, but Alexander seemed genuinely concerned. He was talking about a family meeting to discuss how to approach the situation and present a united front. The manipulation was so transparent, it would have been laughable if it weren't so hurtful. Alexander couldn't control me directly, so he was attempting to mobilize his siblings to apply pressure on his behalf. Melissa, I said carefully, what I told Alexander was that my estate plan is mine to determine based on my values and relationships, and that he shouldn't count on an inheritance that might not materialize for decades as part of his financial planning. I never threatened to disinherit anyone. That's what I thought, she said, relief evident in her voice. Tim didn't believe him either, but Alexander was so convincing. He has this way of making his version of events sound like the only logical interpretation. Yes, I agreed dryly. He's always had that particular talent. So what should we do? Melissa asked. He's planning this whole strategy session at his house tomorrow night. I considered the situation carefully. My first instinct was to confront Alexander immediately, to call him out on this deliberate misrepresentation of our conversation. But that approach would likely only escalate tensions and push him further into defensive tactics. Nothing, I said finally. You and Timothy do nothing. Don't go to his strategy session, don't engage with his version of events. Just tell him you've spoken to me directly and understand there's been a misinterpretation. You're not going to confront him? Melissa sounded surprised. Not immediately, I explained. Alexander needs time to recognize that his old patterns of controlling the narrative aren't going to work anymore. If you and Timothy refuse to participate in his drama, he'll have no audience for it. There was a pause as Melissa processed this approach. That's actually really smart, Mom. Makes him face the consequences of his actions without creating more conflict. Something I learned raising 3 strong-willed children, I said with a small smile she couldn't see. Sometimes the most effective response is simply refusing to play the game. After hanging up with Melissa, I spent a restless evening contemplating my next steps. Alexander's attempt to rally his siblings against me was concerning not just for its manipulative nature, but because it revealed how deeply entrenched his control issues were. Our conversation, which I had hoped might mark a turning point, had instead triggered a more desperate attempt to maintain his influence. The next morning, I called Frank Chen and requested a comprehensive review of all my accounts, focusing particularly on access protocols and security measures. If Alexander was willing to misrepresent our conversation to his siblings, I needed to ensure he couldn't take more direct action regarding my finances. I can implement two-factor authentication on all digital access points, Frank suggested, after I explained the situation. And we should probably change all your passwords and security questions just to be safe. Do it, I agreed. And Frank, I'd like to review my powers of attorney as well. I want to be absolutely certain about who has what authority and under what specific conditions. Next, I called Eleanor to update her on the situation. Her response was measured but concerned. This is escalation behavior, she observed. When direct control failed, he's trying indirect methods through family pressure. If that doesn't work, he might consider more drastic approaches. Such as? I prompted, though I already had some idea of what she might suggest. In extreme cases, adult children sometimes attempt to establish guardianship or conservatorship over elderly parents, she said carefully, usually through claims of diminished capacity or inability to make sound decisions. The mere suggestion sent a chill through me. Surely Alexander wouldn't go that far. I don't think he would, Eleanor reassured me. The bar for such actions is quite high, especially for someone like you who has no documented cognitive issues and maintains an active, independent life. But we should prepare for the possibility, however remote. What would that preparation entail? I asked. First, a current medical evaluation documenting your cognitive health, she suggested. Second, an updated estate plan that explicitly addresses decision-making capacity and your wishes regarding guardianship if it ever became necessary. And third, a letter of competency from a geriatric specialist that could be provided to financial institutions if questions were ever raised. The precautions seemed excessive, almost paranoid, but Eleanor's legal experience made her cautious about worst-case scenarios. I agreed to schedule the medical evaluation, though I hoped it would prove unnecessary. The day progressed quietly as I attended to normal routines, a trip to the grocery store, lunch with a friend from my book club, an hour in the garden tending to my roses. The ordinary rhythm of life continued despite the extraordinary tension with my eldest son. That evening, my doorbell rang just after 7. I wasn't expecting visitors, and a quick glance through the peephole revealed Timothy standing on my porch, his expression serious. I thought you should know, he said as soon as I opened the door. Alexander's strategy meeting isn't happening. Melissa and I both declined to attend. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by their solidarity. Would you like to come in? I just made some iced tea. Timothy followed me to the kitchen, watching as I poured 2 glasses from the pitcher in the refrigerator. Alexander wasn't happy about our refusal, he continued. He accused us of abandoning family responsibilities. I handed him a glass, shaking my head at the transparent manipulation. Your only family responsibility in this situation is to respect my autonomy. That's essentially what Melissa told him, Timothy said with a hint of pride in his sister's directness. She said her responsibility was to you, not to his agenda. We moved to the porch, settling into the comfortable wicker chairs that had witnessed countless family conversations over the years. The evening was mild, cicadas creating a rhythmic backdrop to our discussion. I'm sorry it's come to this, I said after a moment. I never wanted to create divisions among you 3. Timothy looked at me directly, his gaze steady and clear. You didn't create this division, Mom. Alexander did by refusing to accept boundaries and trying to control a situation that isn't his to control. His insight surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Timothy had always been the most perceptive of my children, observing dynamics that others missed. Still, I sighed, it's painful to watch your children in conflict, especially when you're the center of it. Alexander will come around eventually, Timothy said with more confidence than I felt. When he realizes his usual tactics aren't working, he'll have to find a new approach, hopefully one that involves actual respect. I hope you're right, I said, though doubt lingered. Alexander's stubborn nature had served him well in business, but created significant challenges in personal relationships. His determination was both his greatest strength and his most problematic trait. In the meantime, Timothy continued, Melissa and I have been talking. We want to make sure you know you have our support, whatever comes next. The simple statement of solidarity brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Throughout this difficult process, I had been so focused on establishing boundaries and defending my autonomy that I hadn't fully appreciated the positive shifts occurring with my other children. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than, you know. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea and watching the fireflies begin their evening dance across the lawn. It was a moment of peace amid turbulence, a reminder that even in difficult family seasons, connection remained possible. The next morning brought another unexpected development. My phone rang early, Alexander's name appearing on the caller ID. I answered with cautious curiosity, wondering what new approach he might be attempting. Mom, he began without preamble. I've been thinking about our conversation at the cafe. Yes? I prompted when he paused. You were right, he said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. I haven't been respecting your autonomy. I've been treating you like someone who needs management rather than a capable adult who happens to be my mother. The admission was so unexpected that for a moment I wondered if this was a new manipulation tactic, but Alexander continued before I could respond. I talked to Vanessa last night, really talked to her about everything that's happened. She pointed out something I hadn't considered, that I've been approaching your finances the way I approach corporate acquisitions, looking for efficiency and control rather than understanding the human factors involved. It was an insightful observation, one that perfectly captured Alexander's fundamental mistake. He had treated me as an asset to be optimized rather than a person with agency and dignity. That's a helpful perspective, I said carefully, still uncertain where this conversation was heading. I also want to apologize for what I said to Timothy and Melissa, he continued. I misrepresented our conversation and tried to create pressure that wasn't appropriate. It was not my finest moment. Now I was genuinely surprised. Alexander rarely acknowledged missteps, particularly not so directly. What prompted this change of heart? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism completely from my voice. There was a brief pause before he answered. Would you believe a photograph? A photograph? I repeated, confused. Vanessa was looking through old albums last night and found a picture from about 15 years ago, he explained. Dad and I were on the boat, and you were sitting at the Marina Cafe working on your laptop. Vanessa asked what you were doing in the photo, and I realized I had no idea. When I really thought about it, I remembered you were always working on financial spreadsheets or research whenever we went sailing, Dad and I on the water, you managing investments from shore. The memory came back to me clearly. Those peaceful Saturday mornings when Howard and Alexander would take the small sailboat out on the harbor, while I used the quiet time to review our portfolio and research potential adjustments. It had been our routine for years, a comfortable division of leisure that suited all our preferences. I never thought about what you were actually doing during those hours, Alexander continued. I just assumed it was, I don't know, household accounts or something simple. But it wasn't, was it? You were managing our entire financial future while Dad and I played around on the water. I enjoyed it, I said truthfully. The research, the analysis, watching our investments grow. It was never a burden. But I never acknowledged it, he said, regret evident in his voice. I never even saw it, really. And then after Dad died, I just assumed you wouldn't be able to continue without him, when in reality, he was the one who would have struggled without me, I finished. Gently, yes. The single word carried weight, an acknowledgement of a truth long overlooked. So what happens now? I asked, echoing his question from our cafe conversation. Now I back off, he said simply. I respect your boundaries, your expertise, and your right to make your own decisions. And I start focusing on my own financial, planning for Emma and Jacob's education instead of counting on an inheritance that isn't mine to claim. The commitment sounded genuine, but experience had taught me to be cautious about Alexander's promises. I appreciate that, I said, and I hope you mean it. I do, he insisted. I've already called Craig Winters and terminated our consulting arrangement. I told him not to contact you again under any circumstances. That concrete action, more than any words, suggested Alexander might truly be reconsidering his approach. Thank you, I said, allowing a note of warmth to enter my voice. That means a lot to me. I can't promise I won't ever express concerns if I think something is genuinely wrong, he cautioned. But I'll do it respectfully, directly to you, and I'll accept your decisions even when I disagree with them. That's all I've ever asked. 4, I reminded him. Respect for my autonomy, not blind agreement with every choice I make. We talked for a few minutes more, the conversation still carrying an undercurrent of caution, but markedly different from our recent interactions. When we hung up, I sat quietly in my kitchen, processing this unexpected shift. Was it genuine? Only time would tell. Alexander had spent decades developing his controlling tendencies. They wouldn't disappear overnight. But the fact that he had acknowledged them at all represented significant progress. For now, I would maintain the security, measures Frank and Eleanor had recommended while cautiously opening the door to rebuilding trust with my son. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a first step toward a new kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority. Later that afternoon, as I tended to my garden, I reflected on the past few months and the extraordinary journey they had represented. What had begun with my son claiming I was too forgetful for money decisions had evolved into a profound reckoning about power, autonomy, and the complex dynamics between adult children and their aging parents. I hadn't forgotten to cancel those credit cards. I had remembered exactly who I was and what I deserved. Respect for my capabilities, recognition of my autonomy, and relationships built on mutual trust rather than control. The path forward wouldn't be smooth or straight. Alexander's old patterns would resurface. New challenges would emerge as I continued aging. But something fundamental had shifted in our family system, a rebalancing of power and perspective that created space for healthier connections. As I worked among the roses Howard had planted years ago, I found myself smiling at the memory of his favorite saying about our garden. Pruning looks like damage until you see the blossoms that follow. Perhaps this difficult period had been necessary pruning for our family, painful but ultimately creating opportunity for new growth. Time would tell what blossoms might emerge from this season of change. For now, it was enough to know I had remembered my worth and found the courage to defend it. Not just for myself, but for the authentic relationships that could only thrive when built on foundations of genuine respect. 3 months had passed since my confrontation with Alexander, a season of cautious rebuilding and small steps toward a new normal. Our first quarterly family meeting approached, the formalized gathering I had proposed to keep everyone informed while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I'd chosen to host it at my home rather than Eleanor's office, a deliberate signal that we were moving from crisis to reconciliation. The morning of the meeting, I walked through my garden with a mug of tea, taking comfort in the familiar ritual. The roses were nearly finished for the season, a few stubborn blooms holding on despite the autumn chill. Howard had always said, "Gardens taught the best lessons about patience. You couldn't rush growth, couldn't force blooms to appear before their time." Relationships, I was learning, followed similar principles. I had spent the previous week preparing financial summaries with Frank, creating clear, accessible reports on my accounts, investments, and overall financial health. Not because I owed my children this transparency, but because I had chosen to offer it as a foundation for our new relationship dynamics. The reports demonstrated both my ongoing competence and my willingness to share appropriate information voluntarily. The key distinction being that I controlled what was shared and when. Melissa arrived first, 20 minutes early with a basket of fresh pastries from the bakery near her apartment. "Thought we might need sustenance for what could be an intense discussion," she explained with a self-deprecating smile as she set the basket on my kitchen counter. "Always thinking ahead," I said, squeezing her hand affectionately. "How are you feeling about today?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Cautiously optimistic? Alexander has been different lately. Less directive, more thoughtful. Timothy says he's noticed it too." The observation aligned with my own experience. In the weeks following our Harbor Cafe conversation, Alexander had maintained a respectful distance while still checking in regularly. Our conversations remained somewhat formal, but lacked the controlling undertone that had characterized our interactions for years. Whether this represented genuine growth or simply a tactical retreat remained to be seen. Timothy and Diane arrived, next, bringing a bottle of Howard's favorite wine. A thoughtful gesture that acknowledged his continuing presence in our family gatherings even in his absence. Diane embraced me warmly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you," in my ear before pulling back with a conspiratorial wink. Her support meant more than she likely realized. Alexander and Vanessa were precisely on time, as expected. Alexander carried a sleek leather portfolio, reminiscent of the one he'd brought to our disastrous family meeting months earlier, but his demeanor was markedly different. Less commanding, more contained. Vanessa greeted me with genuine warmth, her eyes communicating unspoken understanding between women who had both experienced Alexander's controlling tendencies from different perspectives. "Thank you all for coming," I said once everyone was settled in the living room, the space where we had gathered for holidays and celebrations throughout my children's lives. I thought we'd start with a brief update on my financial situation, then open the floor for any questions or concerns. I distributed the summary reports Frank had helped me prepare, giving everyone time to review the material. The documents provided a comprehensive overview of my assets, investment strategy, and financial projections, without revealing unnecessary details about specific accounts or security measures. "As you can see," I continued when they had finished reviewing the reports, "my financial situation remains stable and well managed. The portfolio has performed slightly above market benchmarks for the quarter, and all planning targets for the next 5 years remain on track." Alexander studied the reports with professional attention, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. When he looked up, his question surprised me with its straightforward respect. "These projections account for potential market downturns?" he asked, indicating a section of the report that outlined contingency planning. "Yes," I confirmed. "Frank and I have stress-tested the portfolio against 3 different recession scenarios, ranging from moderate to severe. The reserve allocations have been adjusted accordingly." He nodded, appearing genuinely satisfied with the answer rather than searching for weaknesses to exploit. It was a small shift, but significant. "Mom, this is really impressive," Melissa commented, genuine admiration in her voice. "I wish I understood investments half as well as you do." "You could," I said simply. "It's not magical knowledge. just experience and learning over time. Maybe you could teach me sometime, she suggested, the request tentative but sincere. Not because I'm worried about you, she added hastily, but because I should probably understand these things better for my own future. The request touched me deeply. Not only was it an acknowledgement of my expertise, but it represented a desire to connect through knowledge sharing rather than control. I'd like that, I agreed. We could set up regular sessions if you're serious about learning. The conversation flowed naturally from there, moving from financial specifics to broader family matters. Timothy and Diane shared news about their daughter Sophia's college applications. Melissa discussed a promising new client for her design business, and Alexander provided a brief update on Emma and Jacob's school activities. When the formal part of our gathering concluded, we moved to the dining room for lunch. A simple meal I had prepared the previous day, supplemented by Melissa's pastries and the wine Timothy and Diane had brought. As we ate, I observed the subtle dynamics among my children, noting how dramatically they had shifted in just a few months. The tension that had characterized our interactions since Howard's death had largely dissipated, replaced by a cautious but genuine warmth. Even Alexander seemed more at ease. His typical corporate intensity softened into something more approachable. At one point, he actually laughed at one of Timothy's medical humor jokes, a rare moment of unguarded enjoyment I hadn't seen from him in years. After lunch, as everyone prepared to leave, Alexander lingered behind, obviously waiting for a private moment. Once the others had moved to the front porch to admire the fall foliage, he approached me in the kitchen where I was loading the dishwasher. "Mom?" he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to give you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, which he placed on the counter between us. "These are the college fund statements for Emma and Jacob," he explained. "I've opened 529 plans for both of them and funded them with initial contributions from Vanessa and me." I looked at him questioningly, uncertain why he was sharing this particular information. "I wanted you to see that I'm taking responsibility for their education," he clarified. "Not counting on inheritance or making assumptions about your estate. This is me acknowledging that their future is my responsibility, not yours." The gesture moved me deeply, not just for its practical implications but for what it represented. Alexander taking concrete action to demonstrate his changed perspective, not just offering words that might prove empty. "Thank you for showing me this," I said sincerely. "It means a lot." He nodded, seeming almost embarrassed by the moment's emotional weight. "There's something else I wanted to ask you," he continued after a brief pause. "A favor, actually." "Oh?" I prompted, curious, but cautious. "Would you consider meeting with Emma and Jacob to talk about financial literacy? Nothing formal, just sharing some of your knowledge. I realize neither Vanessa nor I have your gift for explaining these concepts in accessible ways." The key request stunned me momentarily. After years of Alexander dismissing my financial expertise, he was now actively seeking it for his children's benefit. "I'd be happy to," I said once I'd recovered from my surprise. "Perhaps we could start with some basic concepts about saving and compound interest, then progress from there based on their interest levels." "That would be perfect," he agreed, visible relief in his expression. "And Mom? I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize what Dad always knew, that you're the financial brain in the family." The simple acknowledgement, offered without qualification or strategic purpose, felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Not complete healing, not yet, but genuine progress toward a more balanced relationship. After everyone had left, I sat on the porch swing in the late afternoon light, reflecting on the day's events and the journey of the past few months. The swing creaked gently with each movement, the same comforting sound that had accompanied countless conversations with Howard over the years. "You were right, my love," I said softly to the empty space beside me, imagining Howard's knowing smile. Family conflicts are never really about the surface issues. What had appeared to be a battle over financial control had ultimately revealed much deeper currents. My children's fears about aging and loss, Alexander's need for control in the face of uncertainty, our collective struggle to redefine relationships. After Howard's death, the credit cards had been merely a symptom, not the underlying disease. As autumn sunlight filtered through the maple tree Howard had planted when Timothy was born, I allowed myself to acknowledge both the pain and growth of recent months. The confrontations had been necessary, the boundaries essential. Through them, I had reclaimed not just my financial autonomy but my full identity as more than just a mother or widow. My phone chimed with a text message from Eleanor. "Just checking in. How did the meeting go?" "Better than expected," I typed back. "Real progress with Alexander. We'll call tomorrow with details." Her response came quickly. "Wonderful news. Proud of you for standing your ground. This is what healthy boundaries look like." Healthy boundaries. The phrase resonated deeply. I had learned, late in life but not too late, that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. It was control wearing love's clothing. By asserting my autonomy, I hadn't damaged my relationships with my children. I had created the possibility of more authentic connections based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority. The credit cards I had canceled months ago had become something of a symbol in my mind. A line drawn, a declaration of selfhood that rippled through every aspect of my life. That single decisive action had triggered a cascade of changes, both painful and healing, that continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have anticipated. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my garden, I found myself filled with a quiet gratitude. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't, and likely never would be. But because I had remembered my own worth and found the courage to defend it. Because my children, in their different ways, were learning to see me as I truly was rather than as the diminished version they had constructed in their minds. When my son claimed I was too forgetful for money decisions, I hadn't just remembered to cancel their credit cards. I had remembered who I was, Gertrude Blackwood, a woman of capability and dignity who deserved respect, not management. That, remembering had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.